Okay, hi everybody. Good afternoon. I actually want to start by adding some information for those of you who heard the first lecture this morning. I was asked two questions. One was, what was the sentence that Dinko Šakić was sentenced to in Croatia? I said the maximum sentence. The maximum sentence was 20 years in prison. By the way, he was not charged with genocide, but that was a political decision by the Croatians, who had their own problems putting him on trial. But that's the good news, and he also died in prison. But there's a very interesting postscript to the story, because Šakić asked to be buried in his Ustasha uniform, and the Catholic priest who delivered the eulogy said the following at his funeral. It's true that Dinko Šakić did not observe all the 10 commandments, like thou shalt not murder, for example, okay? But he was a model for Croatia, okay? Now, as far as the other question was, what happened to István Bojtásó, the Hungarian gendarmerie master sergeant who bragged about being involved in the deportations of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz in '44. So what happened was that I went to Miskolc. We learned that he had been active in Miskolc. We circulated his photograph to the Jewish community, and we circulated the call for witnesses to come forward, survivors from Miskolc. No one had any knowledge of Bojtásó. We never found a single document that would even confirm that he had even been in the gendarmerie. So that's the answers to the other two questions. But today we're talking about something connected, but a little different. This year, for the period of slightly less than a month, 29 days to be precise, I had the dubious privilege of attending, monitoring, and protesting against 4 neo-Nazi / extreme right or fascist marches in the Baltic countries of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And there were basically two themes. First of all, I have to say it was a very, very frustrating experience, a very painful experience to see hundreds of people marching through the main avenues of the capital cities in Lithuania, in Vilna, and actually there was a second march in Kovna, in Riga, in Latvia, in Tallinn, in Estonia, and yelling all the most disgusting slogans and having the most disgusting banners. And to be perfectly honest, actually in one of these marches, I was standing there alone as the only protester, and I had my scary moments. But in any event, I thought it was very, very important for us to monitor, for us to protest, and my colleague in this respect is Professor David Katz, who began this process of monitoring, and it was his bravery in standing alone against these people that encouraged me or inspired me and motivated me to join him, and even to go to some places that he didn't go to. Now, there are basically two themes that the demonstrators in these marches wanted to emphasize. One was the hatred or the hostility towards the minorities in these countries. So in Lithuania, it's the Poles, the Russians, the Jews. In Latvia and Estonia, it's the Russians, but the Russians also include the Jews. Now, this, of course, is one of the major themes of the extreme right, but I have to say that these sentiments are not shared by the governments. The governments are democracies. The communities are not in any real danger in that respect. And the level of anti-Semitism there, anti-Semitism obviously exists, but it takes other forms. And one of the forms that it takes is a phenomenon that I call Holocaust distortion. I'm sure you all know about Holocaust denial, the attempt to claim either that the Shoah didn't take place or that the Shoah was of much smaller scope than it actually was. The good news is that in the Western world, I emphasize, not throughout the world, in the Western world, the fight against Holocaust denial has to a large extent been won. And I say this not because there will never be anyone who will try and deny the Holocaust. There will be such people, and we obviously will maintain our vigilance. But there's no mainstream normative political party or social organization in the Western world which disseminates Holocaust denial, which believes the lies of the Holocaust deniers, which are basically a new form of anti-Semitism. And I very often wonder whether given the enormous amount of documentation of all sorts, whether it's photographs, films, documents, millions of documents that make the Holocaust the most documented tragedy in human history, whether the deniers even believe what they're saying. Of course, in the Arab world, it's a completely different issue. So it's important to remember that in the Arab world, Holocaust denial is very often government-sponsored and government-financed, and this makes it much more dangerous. When the president of a country, Ahmadinejad, the former president of Iran, for example, goes on television and brazenly proclaims that the Holocaust is a myth, that has more weight or more potential to attract support or attention than if some nutcase somewhere just tries to put out a book or make a movie or do whatever. But today, the subject of the talk is Holocaust distortion, which is also a new form of anti-Semitism and a phenomenon which, in my mind, is extremely dangerous and extremely difficult to fight against because it's not as obviously a form of anti-Semitism as Holocaust denial. When you hear people say the Shoah didn't happen, you immediately understand that this is a form of anti-Semitism and this is pure bullshit. Pardon my Chinese, okay? But Holocaust distortion is a phenomenon that is very strong and growing in Eastern Europe. And in order to explain the roots of it, I have to go back to the historical background and tell you why and how Holocaust, the collaboration with the Nazis in Eastern Europe, was significantly different than collaboration with the Nazis elsewhere. The Nazis sought to enlist local help in every single country. In other words, all the countries of Europe, with the exception of the 6 neutrals. The neutrals were Spain and Portugal, Turkey, Sweden, Ireland, and Switzerland. All the rest of Europe was either occupied by the Nazis or allied with Nazi Germany. Now, there were 3 reasons why the Nazis wanted to enlist local help. 1 ideological reason and 2 practical reasons. The ideological reason was that they wanted to show that everyone supported the measures that were being taken against the Jewish population. The 2 practical reasons were that the Nazis were very short on manpower. Remember, they were occupying territory from the Atlantic Ocean, from France, all the way deep into Russia, and from the North Sea, from Norway down to Greece. That's an enormous area. They did not have sufficient manpower to carry out all the operations that they sought to do. Every local helper who was enlisted freed a Nazi from Hamburg or an Austrian from Vienna to go somewhere else where they were more badly needed. The second reason was very practical. The Nazis are embarking upon a plan of mass annihilation of the Jewish population. They come to a country like Lithuania or Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine. They don't know the local language. They don't know the local geography or topography. They need local help to carry out this horrible mission. Now, in effect, they succeeded in enlisting help in every single country, even in Denmark, for example. Okay? Today we know that there were thousands of Danish SS volunteers. And as a matter of fact, one of the recent revelations is that there was a Judenlager, a camp for Jews in Babrusk, Belarus, which was guarded by Danish SS volunteers. And in the course of the time when they were in charge of the camp, which was from the fall of 1942 to the spring or summer of 1943, 1,400 Jews were murdered by the Danes. And we've already found at least one of those guards in Copenhagen. Okay, but this is just one small example. But in any event, there was a significant difference between the nature of the collaboration with the Nazis in Eastern Europe and outside Eastern Europe. Outside Eastern Europe, Take countries like France, Belgium, Holland. Those collaborators helped implement the initial stages, the initial steps of the final solution. Jews were defined. They were robbed of their property. They were denied a livelihood. They were concentrated. They were arrested. They were put on trains, or in the case of Norway, on boats, or Greece, Crete, on boats. And they were sent to be killed somewhere else. That somewhere else was Poland. Now, I'm not saying this to in any way condone what they did, but it was significantly different from what happened in many countries in Eastern Europe. Because the Vichy police were not the ones who systematically murdered French Jews, nor were the Dutch NSB, the collaborators, etc. In Eastern Europe, the situation was very different. In Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, Belarus, Croatia, the Nazis incorporated the local helpers into the mass murder. Okay? And they played a very significant role, as we'll see, in the mass murder. In Hungary, this morning I spoke to you about the Hungarian gendarmerie who carried out the murders in Novi Sad. The Hungarians also participated in the murder of Hungarian Jews who were deported to Kamenets Podolsk, who didn't have Hungarian citizenship. Of course, the Hungarians also have the model of Western Europe, because in the spring and summer of 1944, they deported 437,000 Hungarian Jews to be murdered at Auschwitz. That's the Western European model. But they participated in murders also in the fall of 1944 in Budapest, when Ferenc Szálasi took over as prime minister with the assistance of the Nazis, and it was open season on Jews. And in those days, they used to say that the blue Danube had turned red from the blood of all the Jews whose bodies were thrown into the Danube. Romania was actively involved in the murder of Jews in Odessa, in the Ukraine, with the Romanian troops who accompanied the Nazi troops as they invaded the Soviet Union. So in other words, this is something that is significantly different from what happened elsewhere. But the problem was, or one of the problems was, that this entire area did not become democratic at the end of World War II. These areas were liberated from the Nazis, but were occupied by the communists. And the communists did their own manipulation of the history of World War II. So in other words, these countries were not free in other words, they couldn't speak freely, teach the truth, learn the truth, etc. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I'm sure all of you know about Babi Yar. Babi Yar is a ravine outside Kiev, where on September 29th, 30th, 1941, over 33,000 Jews were murdered by the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi mobile killing units, and the Ukrainian security police, Nazi collaborators. For many years, there was nothing to mark the spot, no indication that a terrible massacre had taken place there. And then some genius in the Kiev municipality suggested, why don't we build a soccer stadium on Babi Yar? It's empty, nothing's happening there. And the truth of the matter is, it might actually have happened if not for the brave Russian poet, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who wrote a poem called Babi Yar, and basically issued a cry on behalf of the victims. And in the wake of that poem and the incredible resonance it had in the West, the plan was shelved. What did the authorities do in Kiev? They put up a little monument basically talking about peace-loving Soviet citizens who were killed there by the Hitlerite fascists. Now, I don't know if you recognize the language. This is typical Soviet language for the murder of Jews during World War II. I'll give you another example. I don't know how many of you have been to Vilna or been to Lithuania. But during the Soviet period, at Ponar, or Panarai in Lithuanian, the site of the murder of 70,000 Jews, the Jews of Vilna, the Jews of Shventsian, and that area around Vilna. 70,000 Jews murdered. The Soviets put up a monument which says very simply, to the victims of fascism. Very interesting. What does that sign hide? It hides two very important things: the identity of the victims and the identity of the killers. You go to Rumbula, outside Riga. the site of the mass murder of close to 30,000 Latvian Jews, November 30th, December 8th, 1941. Monument says during the Soviet times, to the victims of fascism. Now, why were those captions used? They were used because the Soviet Union refused to acknowledge that the Jewish people were a major ideological enemy and target of the Nazi movement. They wanted you to think that the World War II was basically a battle, an ideological battle between communism and Nazism, which communism had won. And they also wanted to hide the fact that Soviet people, Soviet citizens, had murdered fellow Soviet citizens. In other words, whether it's in Ukraine or in Latvia or in Estonia or Lithuania, Soviet Lithuanian citizens murdered Soviet Jewish citizens, and that, of course, did not fit the myth of the brotherhood of Soviet peoples. So it was only in 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, these countries became democratic, broke away from the Soviet Union, the ones who were part of the Soviet Union. The other countries, Romania, Hungary, which were under communism, became democracies. And for the first time ever, the truth could be told, the truth could be written, the truth could be taught. But that truth is not a very easy truth to teach. And I want to focus on Lithuania in that regard. And of course, I don't have to explain why to this audience. And I can tell those of you who didn't hear me this morning that I'm also a Litvak. And I happen to be named, actually, for a Lithuanian Jew who was murdered here, not here, in Vilna, during the Shoah. So if we talk about what happened in Lithuania, let's start with the first days. One of the major points of debate with the Lithuanian government is that they simply refused to admit that Lithuanians murdered Jews in Lithuania even before the first Nazi showed his face. In 46 different cities, towns, villages, shtetls, armed Lithuanians attacked the Jewish population before the first Nazis showed up. Lithuanians refused to admit that. Second point, who were the killers? So first of all, it's important to note that in many cases, and I can give you a list here of the shtetlach, there were no Germans present when the Jews were murdered. Only Lithuanians. In Lazdai, in Tels, in Aishishuk, in Janishuk, in Dubinga, in Babte, in Varena, in Vadziogala. Those are the Lithuanian names, but you can find the Jewish names as well. In Onishkis, in Vilkavish, and Verbalis, the only Germans who were there were photographers. They took pictures. The Lithuanians did the murders. Now, I'll never forget, in June of 1991, I was invited to the ceremony dedicating a new monument at Ponar. I told you about the old monument to the victims of fascism. Now, with the help of a Jewish survivor of Vilna, Mr. Spiegel, a very impressive monument was built and was going to be dedicated in June of 1991. I was invited to the ceremony. By the way, there was a very bitter battle before the ceremony over the wording of the plaques on this monument. The plaques were in 4 languages: in Lithuanian, in Russian, in Hebrew, and in Yiddish. And the problem was that the Lithuanian authorities were not willing to write on all the plaques, and certainly not on the ones in Lithuanian and Russian, that the Jews had been killed by the Nazis and their local helpers. That was omitted. It was only included in Hebrew and in Yiddish. Okay? Come to the ceremony. The keynote speaker, featured speaker, is none other than the Prime Minister of Lithuania, at that time, Gediminas Vagnorius, who said the following: "It's true, this was a terrible tragedy, a tragedy which lasted 3 months." So I'm saying, I'm listening, and I can't believe my ears. What 3 months is he talking about? The Shoah in Lithuania was more than 3 years. It started on June 22nd, 1941, and it ended in the summer of 1944 when the Red Army liberated Vilna and Kovna and the rest of Lithuania. So what's the 3 months? That's for starters. Then it got even worse. He said, it's true, there were some people, some hooligans, local hooligans, who participated in the murders, but that cannot overshadow the enormous help provided by Lithuanians to Jews to save them. I already hear the chuckles in the audience. That means you're knowledgeable about the truth of what happened in Lithuania. So first of all, I want to say that we Jews owe a phenomenal debt of gratitude to those Lithuanian righteous Gentiles, righteous among the nations, who really saved Jews. People like Ona Shamaita in Vilna, people like Dr. Elena Kutrogiena in Kovna, and many others. They're heroes. They're real heroes. They're the real heroes of Lithuania. Not the people who fought against the communists but murdered Jews during the Shoah. And they deserve our gratitude forever. And they're etched in golden letters in the history of the Jewish people. But they were a small minority. Absolutely nothing compared to the thousands of Lithuanians who participated in the murders. Now, this is another typical trick of the Lithuanian authorities who want to attribute the crimes to a bunch of criminals. Every society has its criminals, and we also have our criminals. So who do you think murdered the Jews? The criminals. But that's not the truth. If you read the history of the 220 Jewish communities in Lithuania during the Shoah, you see in place after place the range, in other words, the phenomenon of collaboration encompassed all strata of Lithuanian society, from the intelligentsia, the local doctor, the local school principal, the pharmacist, the veterinarian, the clergy, all strata, all the way down to the hooligans. In other words, as a matter of fact, Lithuania is the only country in which a specific word was coined for the killers of Jews. It was such a phenomenon. That's another thing that they don't want to acknowledge. I add to this, and you read this in testimony after testimony, one of the most amazing collections of documentation now in Yad Vashem is a collection of testimony regarding the provincial towns. In other words, not Vilna, not Kovna, Ponovich, or Shavel. It's about the 220 Shtetlach, where 100,000 Jews were murdered. And a survivor of the Kovna ghetto by the name of Leib Kunachowski spent 4 years after the Shoah collecting as many testimonies as he could find, and he had a collection of 1,684 pages of beautiful Litvish Yiddish. Okay, every page signed by the witness and by Kunachowski himself. And the importance of the documents are not only the tale, but Kunachowski asked directly, he persevered in asking every single witness, who were the local people who killed the Jews? 1,284 names were collected. And they talk about the cruelty and the humiliations, public humiliations of rabbis. You see it in town after town, or of Jews who were communists, or of communal leaders, raping of young Jewish girls, ages 12, 13, murder of Jewish babies by smashing their heads against rocks or against trees. This was commonplace. And don't ever forget the nationalist component of these murders. I'll give you one example. It's a very famous example. On June 25th, 1941, 52 Jewish men were arrested by Lithuanian vigilantes in the city of Kovna. And they were taken to a place called Liatukas Garage, where there's a big square in the middle. And there, before an enormous crowd of men, women, and children, the Lithuanians murdered these Jewish men in two ways. They either beat them to death with crowbars, or they shoved fire hoses down their mouths and turned on the water to explode their stomachs. And if that's not bad enough, the murders were accompanied by cheering and clapping by an enormous crowd of men, women, and children. And when all the Jews had been murdered, someone took out an accordion and started playing the Lithuanian national anthem, and everyone joined in the singing. And I tell this story to teachers who come to Yad Vashem from many different countries. And I say to them, I ask them, what on earth is the connection between the Lithuanian national anthem and the murder of 52 innocent Jews? And the answer is extremist patriotism. The people who carried out this murder thought that they were doing the patriotic thing. They were saving their country by murdering their fellow Lithuanian Jewish citizens. And all of this, in other words, this is the picture. This is the true picture of Lithuanian collaboration. And after listening to these details, it's not hard to understand why the Lithuanians are doing everything in their power to hide this. In Lithuania today, they talk nonstop about the Shoah. They don't deny the Shoah, not at all. How can you deny it? The country is one big mass grave. But what's the Shoah in Lithuania today? The Shoah is how those nasty Germans and Austrians came to our country and murdered our Jews, Nebuch. Is that true? Of course it's true. That's a big part of it. And without those Germans and Austrians, there wouldn't have been a Shoah. But is it the whole story? Is it the whole truth? Of course not. So Lithuania today is the locomotive which is leading a systematic attempt to change the narrative of World War II and the Shoah. How are they doing it? First of all, they are, for example, artificially inflating the number of righteous Gentiles recognized in Lithuania. You know, Yad Vashem has very specific criteria to determine who is worthy of the very wonderful title of Chasidu Umot Olam, righteous among the nations. Lithuanians are ignoring the criteria. Any Bubba-meister they hear about someone who saved a Jew, right away he's a righteous Gentile. Having said that, they of course are doing the other side of this, the other side of the coin, which is, of course, minimizing the number of the killers. So in Lithuania, there's a Center for Genocide and Resistance Research. Yani Yad Vashem, okay, of the Lithuanians, research-wise, okay? So what do? Yosko Melamed, a survivor of the Kovna Ghetto, the chairman, longtime chairman of the Association of Lithuanian Jewry in Israel, may he live and be well, compiled a list of 23,000 Lithuanian killers. The Lithuanians were in shock. You know, they made believe they were in shock, okay? So the Genocide Center issued a list, 2,055 killers, and they were all acting under orders. And then you ask yourself, 1 second, but the people who gave the orders were Lithuanians. It's all one big Bubba-meister. I'm telling you, one big Bubba-meister. And ironically, even that list disappeared the day after it appeared on the website of the genocide. It disappeared. Trust me, we have the names of thousands of Lithuanians. And I'm not even mentioning, for example, the 2 special murder squads that operated in Lithuania. The Ypatinga Buras, the special ones who murdered the Jews at Ponar. Or the 12th Battalion that set out from Kovna on October 6, 1941, on the way to Minsk to cleanse the area of enemies of the Reich. You know what that means. Kletsk, Slutsk, Dukara, Rudensk, Koidanov, a rampage of mass murder on their way to Minsk, and in Minsk they continued. As a matter of fact, there was a document in the Nuremberg trials that the German governor of Slutsk wrote to his superior in Minsk saying, the Lithuanians made such a chaos here, mayhem, everyone is scared they're going to murder them, and I beg of you, never send this unit to my area again. So that's the real story, but of course this is not the story that you're going to hear. This is not the story being taught. The Lithuanians are busy hiding their crimes, but they're also doing something else that's very, very dangerous. They are leading a campaign to equate communist crimes with Nazi crimes. In other words, the Shoah is not a unique tragedy. It's terrible, it's genocide, blah, blah, blah. But communism was just as bad. Now, this is very important, because if communism is just as bad as Nazism, then obviously it must be a case of genocide. If communism can be categorized as genocide, that means that Jews committed genocide, because among the communists were some Jews. And in fact, in Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, they think that all communists were Jews, or practically all communists were Jews, and that Jews are personally responsible for communism. Okay? Even though their percentage of the Communist Party was no higher than their percentage in the urban population of these places. So in other words, if Jews committed genocide, what are you hacking us a chinik about our people committed genocide? If everyone is guilty, then obviously no one is guilty. Now, this has very, very serious implications. If this is ever accepted, it will destroy 60 years of hard work in commemorating, educating about the Holocaust, researching the Holocaust, to correctly convince the world that the Holocaust was a unique case of genocide, and hopefully will remain a unique case of genocide. Okay, so in other words, if we're claiming the Holocaust is unique, and the Holocaust isn't unique, we're basically trying to fool everybody for our own profit. In other words, it's another anti-Semitic lie. You understand? Now, the manifesto of this movement, to equate communism, promote the canard of equivalency between communism and Nazism. And by the way, communism claimed more victims than Nazism. But communism was in operation for over 40 years. Okay? But what makes the Holocaust unique, if anyone asks you, is very simple. First of all, the ideology of Nazism, which called for the total obliteration of a people throughout the world, ultimately. That's one thing. And the other thing is industrialized mass murder, something that never happened before the Shoah and hopefully will never happen again. In other words, many people suffered under the communists. We have empathy for the victims, and it's true they didn't get in other words, they didn't arouse the sympathy that Holocaust victims arouse, but that doesn't mean that the communism is the Shoah. In any event, the manifesto of this movement is something called the Prague Declaration, signed on June 3rd, 2008 in Prague, and it basically has three demands. One is to rewrite all the textbooks in Europe to reflect the equality or the symmetry between communism and Nazism. A second is to set up an institute, European Institute of Memory and Conscience, to tell the story of Europe during the last century in the spirit of equality between communism and Nazism. And I just want to say one interesting thing here. In the Prague Declaration, they say that this European Institute of Memory and Conscience will assist the local institutions. So let me tell you a little bit about the local institutions. I don't know how many of you have been to Vilna. In Gediminas Prospect, in Gediminas Avenue, the main avenue, the Fifth Avenue of Vilna, there is the Museum of Genocide Victims. And you know what? You know what they talk about in this museum? Until a year ago, only communist victims. And they emphasized the Jewish criminals and the Jewish nature of Bolshevism, of communism. Now, after our protest, they put aside a little room with a couple of words about the Shoah, but it's still 99% communism and 1% about the real genocide that took place at Ponar, 12 kilometers away. Or go to Riga, go to the Museum of the Occupation, where it's actually, the Museum of the Occupation has, right now it's in temporary quarters. They have like 50 panels, 3 on the Holocaust, all the rest on communism. And of the 3 on the Holocaust, one is about the numerous Latvian righteous among the nations. What I said about the Lithuanian Hasidei Umot Olam applies exactly to the Latvians, only in Latvia there were even less righteous Gentiles. Or the Museum of the Occupation in Tallinn, totally dedicated to communist crimes. The third thing is the following. They want a joint memorial day for all the victims of totalitarian regimes. Who are we talking about? Of course, communism and Nazism. And what day do you think they chose to have this joint Memorial Day? Very simple, August 23rd. So I don't know how many of you remember that on August 23rd, or know that August 23rd, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So what's the chap here? What are they trying to tell us? Well, the average person thinks, of course, that Nazi Germany bears the major responsibility, the exclusive responsibility for the horrors of World War II, 50 million people killed, for God's sake. Think again. The Soviets are just as responsible. In other words, they want to compare the people who conceived, planned, built, and operated the biggest mass murder factory in human history, Auschwitz-Birkenau, where 1.3 million people were killed, 1.1 million Jews, and the country, which of course has many faults, but the country whose army liberated Auschwitz and stopped the mass murder. Soviet Union, the Red Army. In other words, that is the big lie. And the problem that we're facing is, quite frankly, that the countries which should be schreien Gewalt, as we say, okay, which should be protesting, for a variety of political reasons, have never taken up this issue. You know what? I just remembered something I want to tell you. It's very important. You know, perhaps one of the symbolic aspects of what Lithuania is doing is the following. About 8 years ago, the Lithuanians decided that they wanted to charge Dr. Yitzhak Arad, former head of Yad Vashem, former chief education officer of Tzal, IDF, and 3 female Jewish anti-Nazi partisans, Rachel Margolis, Fania Bransovsky, and Sarah Genaida, with war crimes. What were the war crimes? They committed war crimes against innocent Lithuanians. But in reality, of course, the Lithuanians that were killed by the partisans were Nazi collaborators. In other words, they wanted to bring them to justice on trumped-up charges to create a false symmetry between crimes by Lithuanians against Jews and crimes by Jews against Lithuanians, as if it's exactly the same thing, the same magnitude, the same scope. So at this point, I want to tell you about a very brave individual I mentioned previously, Professor David Katz, who for many years taught Yiddish at Vilna University, and he was a person who took special interest in the survivors, and because of the knowledge of Yiddish, he's a professor of Yiddish, and helped many of them. Many of these people either had no children, or they had children, the children left, and they were living alone, and they needed help in terms of medicines, in terms of visits, in terms of all this, and David took it upon himself. And for the first 8 years that he taught in Vilna, didn't touch politics at all. As a matter of fact, the people in Lithuania used to tell him, you're from Brooklyn, like Zuroff, but you're a nice guy. You don't deal with politics like Zuroffas. Okay? In any event, when he heard that there was an attempt to put these people on trial, by the way, it was accompanied by horrible incitement against these people in the Lithuanian nationalist press, David made a special effort to fight against this. And I invite all of you to go to his website, Defending History, www.defendinghistory.com. You can learn an enormous amount about this phenomenon. Okay? So what did Lithuanians do to David? They fired him. They fired him from his job as a professor at Vilna University, and unfortunately to this day, he hasn't been able to get a job in Lithuania or elsewhere. Just a small example. In any event, I want to end, because we're coming to the end. The basic problem is that the United States and Canada, the European Union, Israel, should long ago have started to protest against this phenomenon. For a variety of reasons, it hasn't happened. Israel, as you know, has very few allies, and the Lithuanians are trying very hard to cultivate friendship with Israel. But I always say, you know, there's nothing wrong with friends telling friends that a certain phenomenon, a certain thing that's being done is not acceptable. But it hasn't happened yet. And the only country that's really protesting, and very strongly, is Russia. But the problem is that Russia doesn't come with clean hands. They never apologized for communism. They never compensated the victims of communism. They don't commemorate the victims of communism properly. And they're using the events in the Baltics now for their own contemporary political interests to explain why they annexed Crimea and why they're supporting the insurgency in eastern Ukraine. So I would urge all of you to urge the community here, and I already spoke to Rabbi Goldstein and other people, to make sure that you don't get taken in by the charm offensive of the Lithuanians, who very much want your support and your investments and all sorts of other things, and they targeted you as a Litvak community, which can perhaps be exploited for their benefit. So I think we owe it to the victims to do everything in our power to keep their memory alive, and not only their memory, but to set the record straight on who murdered them. Thank you very much.